In the heart of ancient Rome stands the Colosseum, an enduring monument to the might, ambition, and spectacle of an empire that once ruled over vast stretches of the known world. Within its stone arches echoed the roars of the crowd, the clash of steel, and the rituals of power that defined the Roman way of life. Yet beyond the grandeur of its architecture and military conquest, Rome was built on something far more elusive: belief. The Romans lived in a world animated by gods. Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Minerva, each deity held sway over the natural and human realms, their favor sought through public festivals, private prayers, and imperial ceremonies. Religion was not just a personal affair. It was the glue that held society together, interwoven with governance, tradition, and identity. Temples dotted every city, sacrifices marked civic life, and omens guided emperors in times of war and peace. The gods of Rome were as numerous as they were powerful, and their worship formed the foundation of Roman civilization. But amid this vibrant spiritual landscape, a new faith began to emerge, not with fanfare or force, but in whispers, in homes, and in hidden gatherings. Christianity, born in the distant province of Judea, began as a small and persecuted sect with little power, no political backing, and a message that ran counter to the very values of Roman authority. And yet, over the course of just a few centuries, this once marginal movement would rise to transform the empire from within, redefining its culture, politics, and legacy in ways few could have foreseen. How did this happen? How did Christianity, with its crucified Messiah and radical message of equality and salvation, manage to eclipse centuries of tradition and reshape the identity of one of history's greatest empires? This is the story of the rise of Christian power in Rome. For centuries, the Roman Empire stood as a beacon of cultural grandeur, military prowess, and religious diversity. At its heart was a complex and colorful pantheon of gods, beings believed to govern the forces of nature, human destiny, and the very fabric of civilization itself. Roman religion was more than mythology. It was the architecture of meaning in daily life. In every city, on every street, religion was present, etched into stone, spoken in rituals, and revered through festivals. Among the most venerated figures were the great Olympians, adopted and adapted from the Greeks. Jupiter, the king of the gods, stood as the symbol of authority, justice, and divine rule. Mars, the god of war, inspired legions of Roman soldiers and gave his name to the month of March, when campaigns often began. Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, embodied the softer virtues of fertility and allure, while Minerva, the wise and strategic, presided over intellect, craftsmanship, and war alike. These deities, along with countless others, local gods, household spirits, and even deified emperors, formed the spiritual backbone of Roman society. Their worship was not relegated to private belief. It was public, communal, and embedded in every layer of civic life. Triumphal arches, temples, and statues lined the cities. The Roman calendar was structured around religious festivals such as Saturnalia, Lupercalia, and the Consualia, each designed to honor a particular deity and to renew the sacred bond between the people and the divine. Sacrifices, auguries, and priestly rites guided everything from military decisions to agricultural planting. Religion was not an escape from life, it was its very rhythm. Yet, by the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, the pulse of that rhythm began to slow. The old gods, once pillars of certainty, started to feel distant. As the empire expanded, it brought in new gods and exotic cults from the farthest provinces: Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Persia, Cybele from Asia Minor. Rome, always an absorber of cultures, grew increasingly eclectic in its spiritual practices. But this inclusivity, while rich in color and diversity, also hinted at uncertainty. A subtle weariness crept in. The rituals continued, but the fervor waned. The decline of traditional Roman paganism was not caused by a single blow, but by a slow, cumulative shift in both the social and political fabric of the empire. Rome was changing. The gap between rich and poor had widened. Plagues ravaged cities. Corruption and instability plagued the imperial court. In such times, people searched for meaning, something beyond the formal rituals and distant deities of state religion. The gods of marble and myth no longer offered the comfort they once had. Into this spiritual vacuum emerged a faith that offered something radically different: Christianity. Unlike the sprawling pantheon of Rome, Christianity was monotheistic, centered on a single, personal, and loving God. It told of a Messiah who had lived among the people, suffered as they had, and promised redemption not through status or sacrifice, but through faith and grace. For a society weary of imperial politics and religious formalism, this message struck a powerful chord. Christianity's message was revolutionary in its simplicity. All were equal in the eyes of God. Slaves, women, the poor, those often cast aside by Roman social hierarchy, found in Christianity not only solace, but a sense of dignity. The promise of eternal life, of a kingdom not of this world, resonated deeply among the marginalized. Unlike the elaborate rituals of Roman religion, Christian worship was accessible. It took place in homes, in secret gatherings, in whispered prayers, rather than grand processions. Its appeal lay not just in theology, but in community. Over time, the early Christian movement, once persecuted and obscure, gathered momentum. It spread quietly, then rapidly, across the empire. The more Christianity grew, the more it challenged the religious foundations of Rome. Pagan temples were still built, festivals still observed, but beneath the surface, the soul of the empire was shifting. That shift accelerated under the reign of one of Rome's most consequential leaders, Constantine the Great. Initially a pragmatic military commander, Constantine came to view Christianity not as a threat, but as a potential source of unity in an empire fraying at the edges. After his reported vision of the cross before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, Constantine began to champion the Christian cause. The following year, he issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious tolerance to Christians across the empire, a monumental reversal of previous persecutions. But Constantine did more than legalize Christianity. He legitimized it. He funded the construction of churches, gave bishops political influence, and merged Christian symbols with imperial iconography. Under his reign, Christianity emerged from the shadows and took its place in the heart of Roman power. The church, once the haven of outcasts, now found itself intertwined with emperors. Still, the transformation wasn't merely political. At its core, Christianity was reshaping the Roman worldview. The gods of Olympus were timeless, distant, and often indifferent. But the Christian God was intimately involved in human history, concerned with justice, mercy, and love. This shift in divine character changed how Romans thought about authority, morality, and even time itself. No longer was history a cyclical dance of fate. It became a linear story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, moving toward a divine purpose. And so, while temples still stood and sacrifices still burned, the heart of Rome had begun to beat to a new rhythm. Paganism, once the unshakable cornerstone of Roman identity, was gradually giving way to a faith that promised more than tradition. It offered transformation. What began in humble gatherings had now reached the halls of power. And as the empire moved forward, it would do so with a new spiritual compass, one that would redefine its legacy for centuries to come. To understand the extraordinary rise of Christianity in the Roman world, we must begin not in the heart of the empire, but on its distant eastern frontier. It was in the province of Judea, a land marked by political unrest, religious fervor, and imperial tension, that Christianity first took root. Judea had long been a hotbed of resistance against Roman rule. The Jewish people, fiercely monotheistic and deeply devoted to their own religious traditions, chafed under Roman occupation. Into this charged environment, around the early 1st century AD, came a figure who would change the course of history: Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus preached not in palaces or temples, but on hillsides, in marketplaces, among fishermen and tax collectors. His message was deceptively simple, yet profoundly radical. He taught that the kingdom of God was not of this world, a kingdom not built through violence or conquest, but through compassion, humility, and love. His teachings emphasized mercy, forgiveness, and the dignity of every individual, regardless of their status in society. He reached out to the poor, the sick, the outcast, and the sinner. In a world defined by hierarchy and power, Jesus offered a vision of spiritual equality and personal redemption. At the heart of his message was a promise that resonated far beyond Judea, the promise of eternal life. For many living under the weight of Roman oppression, grinding poverty, and systemic injustice, the idea of a loving God who knew them by name and offered salvation was both revolutionary and deeply comforting. This promise stood in sharp contrast to the transactional nature of Roman religion, where the favor of the gods had to be bought through ritual and sacrifice, and where divine justice was often arbitrary or indifferent. Although Jesus was executed by crucifixion, an especially brutal form of capital punishment reserved for enemies of the state, his death did not extinguish his message. Instead, his followers, galvanized by the belief in his resurrection, began to spread his teachings far and wide. First through Judea and Galilee, then throughout the eastern Mediterranean, and eventually into the very heart of the Roman Empire itself. The Apostle Paul, a Roman citizen and one of the most influential figures in early Christianity, played a central role in this expansion. Through his extensive travels and letters, Paul helped shape the theology of the early church and brought the Christian message to major urban centers like Corinth, Ephesus, and most notably, Rome. These communities were not bound by ethnicity or class. They welcomed slaves and free citizens alike, rich and poor, men and women, offering all a place in a spiritual family unlike anything Rome had seen before. Christianity's growth was steady, but not without peril. For nearly 3 centuries, Christians were often viewed with suspicion by Roman authorities. Their refusal to worship the emperor or participate in state-sanctioned religious rites was seen as subversive, even treasonous. Periodic waves of persecution, including the infamous crackdowns under Emperors Nero and Diocletian, sought to stamp out the movement. Yet the faith endured. If anything, the persecutions only strengthened the resolve of believers and elevated the power of the martyr, the one who would rather die than renounce their belief in the risen Christ. By the early 4th century, however, the winds of history began to shift. The Roman Empire, once invincible, was now fragmented by internal division, economic instability, and threats from external enemies. The need for a unifying force, something that could bind the vast and diverse empire together, became increasingly urgent. Enter Constantine the Great. Constantine rose to power during one of Rome's most turbulent periods. As he vied for control of the empire, he is said to have experienced a vision on the eve of the pivotal Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. According to later accounts, he saw a cross in the sky accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." Interpreting this as a divine message, Constantine ordered his soldiers to mark their shields with the Christian symbol of the Chi-Rho. When he emerged victorious, Constantine credited the Christian god for his triumph. The following year, in 313 AD, Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius issued the Edict of Milan. This decree did not make Christianity the state religion, but it did something equally transformative. It legalized it. The edict granted religious tolerance throughout the empire, ending centuries of official persecution and allowing Christians to worship freely. Churches were returned to their congregations, property was restored, and for the first time, Christians could come out of the shadows and into the public square. But Constantine's relationship with Christianity went far beyond political calculation. He saw in the faith a moral structure that could stabilize the empire, a divine authority that could legitimize his own rule, and a unified creed that could transcend the cultural divides of his sprawling realm. He endowed the church with imperial patronage, commissioning the construction of great basilicas, most notably the original St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. He invited bishops to advise him and presided over councils, such as the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, to address theological disputes and codify Christian doctrine. Under Constantine, Christianity began to move from a persecuted sect to an imperial partner. Its leaders gained political influence. Its festivals began to mirror those of Rome. Its bishops sat alongside senators, and its teachings began to reshape the moral language of the empire. No longer was Christianity just a religion of the poor and disenfranchised. It was now a path to power, a cornerstone of imperial identity. Yet, even as it gained favor in high places, Christianity never lost its grassroots appeal. The message of Jesus, the call to love one's neighbor, to forgive one's enemies, to care for the least among us, continued to resonate with the masses. Christian communities still served the sick, fed the hungry, and welcomed the weary. In an empire where the old gods had grown silent and the promises of Rome felt increasingly hollow, the Christian faith offered something real, something personal, something eternal. By the end of Constantine's reign, Christianity had gone from a fringe movement born in the provinces to a central pillar of Roman life. And though it would take decades more for the faith to become the official religion of the empire, its path had been firmly set. A new era was dawning, one in which Rome would no longer be defined by its ancient pantheon, but by the cross of Christ. As Christianity moved from the margins to the mainstream, its true strength became unmistakably clear. Its appeal was not limited to emperors and elites, but to the vast, diverse population of the Roman Empire. In a society structured by class, privilege, and patronage, the message of Christianity offered a new kind of social order, one where every soul held value, where love transcended status, and where suffering could be redeemed. At the heart of this appeal was the New Testament, a collection of writings that captured the life, teachings, and legacy of Jesus Christ. Its tone was intimate, its message direct. Love your neighbor. Forgive those who wrong you. Serve the poor. Honor the humble. The moral clarity and emotional depth of these teachings struck a chord with those who had long been overlooked by Roman society. Slaves, freedmen, women, immigrants, the sick, the elderly, those who lived at the bottom of Rome's towering social pyramid, found in Christianity a spiritual home and a moral compass. More than just theology, Christianity offered community. Early Christian gatherings were not held in temples of stone, but in homes, catacombs, and small, close-knit assemblies. These communities shared meals, cared for one another's needs, and supported members through times of sickness, persecution, and poverty. In a world where many felt powerless, the church became a sanctuary of compassion and purpose. This strong sense of fellowship stood in stark contrast to the impersonal nature of Roman civic religion. The old rituals were grand and public, but they lacked intimacy. Priests performed sacrifices on behalf of the people, but rarely with them. By contrast, Christian worship invited personal participation. Baptism, communion, prayer, all were accessible, meaningful acts that welcomed the believer into a living story of divine grace and human dignity. The social impact of this new faith was particularly visible in its ethic of charity. Christians took seriously the command to care for the least of these. During times of plague and famine, when the wealthy fled the cities, Christians remained behind to nurse the sick and bury the dead, regardless of religious affiliation. Their actions were not only revolutionary in practice, but deeply influential in perception. For many Romans, the behavior of Christians spoke louder than their words. Nowhere was this more evident than in the church's treatment of women. In a society that largely relegated women to the domestic sphere and often denied them education or voice, Christianity offered something profoundly different. Women were among the earliest converts. They hosted churches in their homes, served as deaconesses, and in some cases became martyrs whose stories spread across the empire. Figures like Priscilla, Thecla, and Perpetua emerged as spiritual icons, symbols of courage, leadership, and unwavering faith. The Christian message of inner worth and spiritual equality offered Roman women a role they had never known, that of theological contributor and moral authority. Christian ethics also challenged the dominant Roman virtues of honor, conquest, and personal glory. While Roman culture celebrated dominance and public acclaim, Christianity exalted humility, sacrifice, and inner transformation. It offered a moral counterpoint to the brutality of the Colosseum, the corruption of politics, and the social stratification that defined the empire. In place of cruelty, it offered kindness. In place of hierarchy, community. In place of fear, hope. As the faith spread through cities and provinces, it continued to evolve, developing ecclesiastical structures, theological doctrines, and spiritual disciplines. Yet at its core, it remained rooted in the same foundational truth, that all people, regardless of status, were beloved by God and worthy of grace. This vision of a just, compassionate, and inclusive society not only appealed to individuals, it began to reshape the collective conscience of the empire itself. Christian values seeped into cultural norms, into public debates, into laws and policies. Even as emperors and politicians engaged with the faith on institutional levels, it was the daily witness of ordinary Christians that turned the tide. Their courage in persecution, their consistency in care, and their refusal to abandon the outcast made Christianity not just a religion of doctrine, but a way of life. The growth of the church was not simply a story of conversions, it was a story of transformation. In an empire known for its power, Christianity offered purpose. In a world defined by control, it introduced compassion. And for countless Romans, this new faith didn't just change what they believed, it changed who they were. In its earliest centuries, Christianity did not rise without struggle. Its path from a persecuted minority to an accepted and eventually dominant faith was one marked by resilience, courage, and confrontation with the powers of empire. The road to acceptance was long and often brutal, shaped by a complex web of social, political, and religious anxieties that gripped the Roman world. The Roman Empire prided itself on tolerance, at least in theory. As it expanded across continents, it absorbed countless local traditions and cults, allowing conquered peoples to retain their deities so long as they acknowledged the supremacy of Rome and, crucially, participated in state rituals. Religion in Rome was a matter of public order. Worship of the traditional gods and of the emperor himself in some regions was seen not just as piety, but as patriotism. Civic religion bound citizens to the state and to each other. It was precisely this tight interweaving of religion and politics that made Christianity so troubling to Roman authorities. Unlike other cults, Christians refused to sacrifice to the emperor or pay homage to the Roman gods. They met in secret, used unfamiliar symbols, and spoke of an allegiance to a higher power, Jesus Christ, their crucified Savior and King. To Roman eyes, this was more than superstition. It was subversion, fear of religious dissent, translated into acts of repression. Early Christians were misunderstood, accused of atheism for denying the Roman gods, and even of immorality or cannibalism due to misinterpretations of the Eucharist. But more than anything, they were feared because they operated outside the traditional framework of Roman order. In times of crisis, plagues, famines, invasions, scapegoats were often sought, and Christians, visibly different and stubborn in their refusal to assimilate, made an easy target. The first significant empire-wide persecution came under Emperor Nero in the 60s AD, following the Great Fire of Rome. Desperate to deflect blame for the devastation, Nero accused the Christians of arson. What followed was a spectacle of cruelty. Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed in grotesque public displays. Some were torn apart by wild animals in the arena. Others were crucified or set aflame to light the emperor's gardens at night. These horrors were not just acts of punishment, they were messages, warnings to those who might defy the established order. Yet, remarkably, persecution did not extinguish the faith. If anything, it seemed to strengthen it. Early Christian communities, though forced underground, grew more committed. In catacombs and homes, in secret gatherings and whispered prayers, the faith endured. Stories of martyrs circulated, men and women who met death with unwavering conviction, singing hymns even as they burned or bled. These stories inspired others, reinforcing the belief that the Christian path, though hard, was true and eternal. Over the next 2 centuries, Christians faced various waves of repression. Some emperors ignored them, others sought to root them out. The most systematic attempt came under Diocletian at the turn of the 4th century. Churches were destroyed, scriptures were confiscated, believers were imprisoned or killed. The goal was not just to suppress Christianity, but to erase it. But even the fiercest persecution could not halt its spread. The faith had sunk deep roots across the empire. Converts came not only from the lower classes, but increasingly from merchants, soldiers, and eventually the aristocracy. Christianity had become more than a movement, it was becoming a force. The true turning point came with the rise of Emperor Constantine. His ascent marked a new chapter, not just for the empire, but for the Christian faith. In 312 AD, on the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine is said to have seen a vision, a cross in the sky, accompanied by the words, "In this sign, conquer." Taking the vision as divine instruction, he ordered his soldiers to adorn their shields with a Christian symbol. When he emerged victorious, he attributed his success to the Christian God. The following year, Constantine, alongside his co-emperor Licinius, issued the Edict of Milan. For the first time in Roman history, Christianity was legalized. The edict granted freedom of religion to all citizens, declaring that no one should be denied the right to worship as they chose. It restored confiscated property to Christians, reopened places of worship, and ended the cycle of state-sponsored persecution. The implications of the Edict of Milan were immense. Christianity, once hounded and hunted, was now protected. It could operate openly, organize publicly, and speak confidently. The church moved from the margins of society into its very center. Bishops emerged as local leaders, Christian symbols adorned public monuments, and imperial resources began to flow toward Christian causes. Yet the edict did not merely protect a religion, it marked a transformation in the relationship between faith and power. Constantine's personal embrace of Christianity, even if politically calculated, lent the faith unprecedented legitimacy. The empire, once bound to the old gods of Rome, was now tethered to a new vision, a vision rooted not in myth and hierarchy, but in a God who had suffered and died for humanity. This shift was not without complexity. Paganism still had strongholds, and Christianity itself was not a monolith. Doctrinal disputes, competing factions, and cultural tensions would follow. But the tide had turned. With Constantine's conversion and the Edict of Milan, the centuries of fear and repression gave way to a new era, one of expansion, influence, and eventual dominance. Christianity had survived the flames of persecution. Now it would step into the light of empire. The faith that once hid in shadows would soon shape laws, inspire art, and redefine what it meant to be Roman. The year 313 AD marked a decisive turn in the religious and cultural landscape of the Roman Empire. With the issuance of the Edict of Milan by Emperor Constantine and his co-emperor Licinius, Christianity was no longer a persecuted faith practiced in shadows and secrecy. Instead, it was granted full religious tolerance, an extraordinary reversal of fortunes for a movement that had, only decades earlier, endured brutal repression. The edict proclaimed that all individuals had the right to worship freely, and that Christian churches and properties confiscated during prior persecutions were to be returned. This act of imperial endorsement did not merely offer legal protection, it catalyzed Christianity's transformation from a marginalized sect into a central force within Roman life. The edict set in motion a period of rapid Christian expansion. With state hostility removed, churches sprang up in cities and villages across the empire. Christian leaders, once fugitives and martyrs, became public figures, advisors to emperors, and stewards of growing congregations. Christianity found not only peace but influence, and with that influence came the opportunity to shape society at every level. The effect of this transformation rippled through Roman culture. No longer confined to private homes or hidden catacombs, Christian worship now took place in monumental spaces built with imperial backing. Architecture became a statement of faith. Grand basilicas, Vast, rectangular buildings with vaulted ceilings, ornate altars, and echoing halls began to rise across the empire. These structures, such as the Basilica of St. John Lateran in Rome and the original St. Peter's Basilica, became physical manifestations of Christianity's ascendancy. Where once temples had honored Jupiter or Mars, now churches stood adorned with crosses, baptistries, and mosaics of Christ and the saints. The Roman cityscape was transforming, its sacred geography redrawn in the image of a new spiritual order. But Christianity's influence extended far beyond the physical. The moral and ethical teachings of the faith began to filter into the legal codes of the empire. Under successive Christian emperors, Roman law began to reflect the values of mercy, monogamy, charity, and the sanctity of life. Laws were enacted to support the poor, restrict cruelty to slaves, and promote more equitable treatment within families. Marriage was redefined not simply as a social contract, but as a moral covenant, binding husband and wife in a relationship framed by Christian virtue. Inheritance laws gradually shifted to allow for the protection of widows and orphans, reinforcing the Christian ideal of familial care and social responsibility. The reign of Emperor Theodosius I in the late 4th century would bring the final, irreversible consolidation of Christianity's power. In 380 AD, with the Edict of Thessalonica, Theodosius declared Nicene Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. This declaration did more than recognize the faith, it enshrined it. From that moment forward, Christianity was no longer just tolerated, it was privileged. Paganism, once the spiritual bedrock of Rome, was increasingly marginalized. Temples fell into disuse or were repurposed. Public pagan ceremonies were outlawed. The gods of old, once feared and venerated, faded into cultural memory. This transition was not without resistance, but the tide was unstoppable. The empire's identity was now fundamentally Christian. This new religious orientation reshaped not only governance and social norms, but also art and literature, giving rise to an entirely new cultural language. Pagan myths gave way to biblical narratives. Heroes were no longer demigods and warriors, but saints and martyrs. Christian artists began to develop symbolic languages, fish, lambs, doves, and the chi-rho, that conveyed deep spiritual meaning. The visual emphasis shifted from idealized forms and mythical allegories to stories of faith, sacrifice, and salvation. Art became a means of devotion, education, and evangelism. Literature, too, was transformed. The rhetorical finesse of Roman authors like Cicero found echoes in the sermons and theological writings of church fathers such as Augustine, Jerome, and Ambrose. These thinkers helped bridge the philosophical heritage of Rome with the theological depth of Christian doctrine, creating a literary tradition that would shape Western civilization for centuries. Christian texts were meticulously copied and preserved in monasteries, laying the foundation for medieval scholarship and ultimately the Renaissance. Christian festivals began to align with the Roman calendar, replacing or assimilating older traditions. The once feared day of rest, the Sabbath, became central to the rhythm of weekly life. The birth of Christ, celebrated as Christmas, eventually absorbed aspects of Saturnalia. Easter, commemorating the resurrection, emerged as the most sacred day in the Christian calendar, symbolizing not only spiritual renewal, but the resurrection of the empire under a new moral and divine order. As Christianity became embedded in Roman identity, it also changed the empire's self-image. Where Rome had once seen itself as a civilization chosen by fate, guided by the capricious will of many gods, it now envisioned itself as the earthly manifestation of God's divine plan. This theological shift gave Rome a renewed sense of purpose. The empire was not just a political entity, it was the vehicle of Christian truth, the guardian of spiritual civilization. Yet this transformation was not merely ideological, it had practical consequences. Christian bishops became power brokers, mediators in civic disputes, and custodians of welfare. The church, with its growing wealth and administrative structure, began to parallel the imperial bureaucracy. In time, it would outlast it. By the close of the 4th century, the Roman Empire was no longer what it once had been. Its armies still marched, its roads still stretched across continents, and its laws still governed millions. But its soul had changed. The gods of Olympus were silent. In their place stood the cross, symbol of suffering, hope, and redemption. Christianity, once sown in the soil of a distant province, had grown into the defining force of an empire. Its rise had not only altered the course of Roman history, but had laid the foundation for a new world, a world shaped by faith, framed by scripture, and destined to carry the legacy of Rome into the centuries that followed. The story of Christianity's rise in ancient Rome is not merely one of religious change. It is a sweeping tale of transformation, resilience, and reinvention. What began as a fringe movement in the dusty provinces of Judea, preached by a carpenter's son who walked with the poor and challenged the powerful, would, against all odds, become the spiritual core of the world's greatest empire. Rome, once anchored in the grandeur of Jupiter, the valor of Mars, and the allure of Venus, slowly yielded to a new vision, one shaped not by myth, but by mercy. The empire that had crushed countless rebellions, deified emperors, and enforced its will with legions, now found unity and meaning in the teachings of a man crucified under its own laws. The path was not easy. Centuries of persecution tested the faith of early Christians. Their gatherings were secret. Their lives were at risk. And yet they endured, not with violence, but with conviction. Their strength came not from temples or swords, but from compassion, community, and an unwavering belief in a kingdom beyond this world. With Constantine's conversion and the Edict of Milan, the tide turned. Christianity stepped into the light of imperial favor and reshaped the very identity of Rome. From majestic basilicas to new laws rooted in justice and charity, from the elevation of the humble to the reimagining of art and literature, the Christian faith left no part of Roman life untouched. By the time Theodosius I made Christianity the empire's official religion, the transformation was complete. The gods of old faded into memory. The cross stood where once stood idols of stone. Rome had become something new, a Christian empire whose legacy would echo through centuries, shaping the moral, cultural, and political foundations of the Western world. The rise of Christian power in Rome is a testament to the enduring force of faith, and to the idea that even the most unshakable empires can be changed not by conquest, but by belief.